So we've been in a culture war, we've been in a spiritual war, but we're also in an information war. And you've alluded to quite a bit of it in your segment, but I want to talk about who is behind it. So let's have a look at the nudge unit, because people have heard the term nudge unit and not realize it's an actual thing. Here is the website for the Institute for Government. This is a lobby group set up by Lord Sainsbury, yes, the one from the supermarkets, with the aim to, quote, provide thought leadership on effective government. Now, these guys are used by the Tories, by the Labour Party. These guys are used as spin units to help them sell things. And so the Institute for Government explains for us what the nudge unit is. So established by the Cabinet Office, or in the Cabinet Office. So the nudge unit was a part of the government in 2010. David Cameron's Conservative Lib Dem coalition government set up in the official government with our taxpayers' dollars and not taxpayers' pounds. I'm going
a lot of American politics recently
for that. That's disgusting. And then spun off into a separate company, as they often do with these NGOs, so that they can claim it's an arm's length away from the government. It's not actually the government that's doing the work.
I've done a lot of research into the nudge units. Right. Actually, a lot of the psychology that they use is my research specialization, because I specialized in behavioral decision making.
Yes, great.
So you're on with the right person.
Oh, okay.
So one of the interesting things is this is the only case of a government department or a government institution that has been privately sold off. And it's worth mentioning, I think this happened in 2016, I think.
Yep.
So it got opened up to the private sector partially, and then eventually it got sold off. And now it operates in 51 countries. It might even be more since I last did the research. And it has basically skyrocketed and is getting to the point of almost competing with the Tony Blair Institute in size of sort of scope and scale.
That's quite scary.
And the fact that it has been so profitable and operates in so many countries in such a short space of time indicates to me that there's a significant number of people who are pushing this to succeed.
Oh, there are indeed. And so the nudge unit itself is called the Behavioral Insights Team. And as Josh points out, it was split off from the Cabinet Office and almost sold off, which meant that the people who are there are still there, but they are able to make money from doing what they're doing on top of our taxpayer pounds, because it's going to be partly funded by the government and partly funded by private investment.
Well, it went through a phase of being like that, but I think it's now entirely privately owned.
Is it really?
It is, yeah.
Well, they'll still be getting taxpayer money because the government.
Oh, of course, the government still. Oh, yes, of course. Sorry, I misunderstood.
No, it's fine. And so, if we look at who these people are, the psychologist David Halpern, and his area of expertise is experimental psychology. So we have an expert in experimental psychology running a unit, which is referred to by the government as the nudge unit, consulted by our cabinet, or started in the cabinet, for using experimental psychology on the British public. We have a government at war with its people, essentially. Whatever they're using the psychology for, like, a government should not be using experimental psychology on their own people.
Yes, so experimental psychology is like how you conduct research. But when you're in a position whereby you are advising, say, government policy, and particularly giving policy recommendations, my main gripe with all of this, other than it's horrendously authoritarian, is that the decision-making psychology literature isn't as resounding to say, okay, here is what you need to do for this. You can make some recommendations, you can make suggestions to say, maybe it's this, but it's not definitively settled, because the field of behavioral decision-making is still sort of quite young. Behavioral economics as a discipline has only been around for, about 30 or so years in any serious capacity. And that's not very long in the sciences to have any sort of definitive conclusions. You can get some basics nailed down, but you can't say, okay, we definitively know how to deal with this specific issue of public policy.
Right.
And particularly if people have a political agenda, they're going to design their experiments around proving that they're correct.
Yes.
And in a position like this, I don't think it's optimal to do good research and good experiments.
And actually, it doesn't matter if it's definitive or not, because the purpose of a government is we have a representative democracy, so they're supposed to represent the needs of the people, not manipulate the needs of the people. This is the issue I have with it in terms of how it was used in COVID, when they say they proposed through the unit's measures public to be drilled for future emergencies. The idea that we should push a message so hard that people go along with it rather than asking the people what they want from their government.
Well, this is just something that government does, unfortunately. It's no mystery that I'm very anti-state power. I'm quite libertarian, and this sort of thing is a complete inversion of what democracy is meant to be about.
Yeah.
You're meant to be telling the government what you want it to do, not the government telling you what is best for you. That is, to my mind, a complete perversion of what it's meant to do.
Absolutely. And so they say the purpose of the behavioral insights team is the organization is to influence public thinking and decision making in order to improve compliance with government policy. Again, that is completely backwards and up to inside out from what the government should be doing. And so on the back of that, we have the behavioral insights team, which is called the nudge unit. That's one arm of influencing and manipulating the public. Another arm of it is this. This is the Trusted News Initiative. Now, this is newer than the nudge unit. This one was set up specifically for COVID. And this is essentially a collaboration by the Associated Press, the BBC, Canadian state publishers, Financial Times, all of big tech, so Facebook, Microsoft, Google, including
the
YouTube.
European Broadcasting Union as well.
Yep. So pretty much all
Reuters.
the Western state broadcasters and print publications, everything, the news in general in the West is part of this Trusted News Initiative. And their goals are quite simple: to alert against the most harmful disinformation, right? So who specifies what is disinformation based on what? Well, based on the governments that these companies
Well, the government thinks that it has a monopoly on telling the truth.
Right.
When actually, there are lots of strong incentives that some of the most harmful lies that could possibly be told in a society are most likely to come from a government because they have the most strong incentives to do so.
Yeah.
And so, sure, people might believe some silly stuff. I don't believe that the Earth is flat, or that
But you have a right to.
Yeah, I think it's silly, but I also think that people should be allowed to believe that. If they believe that lizard people are taking over the Earth,
Right.
like they live, they should be allowed to think that.
Again,
as long as they're not harming anyone.
Right.
Yeah.
But some of the governments are explicit in this. So Jacinda Ardern was a good example. She said, "We will be your source of information," as in the news will come from the government. And now, call me old school, but journalism used to be about the media holding the powers that be to account, not working for them, not being their voice. And so this, again, flips the whole process inside out and upside down. They are to discuss trends. Media education. Again, the media isn't there to educate the public. It's there to inform the public. It's nuanced difference, but it's important. And then engineering solutions. So the Trusted News Initiative is there to engineer solutions to the problems that they see around disinformation and what they call disinformation.
So what I would find very interesting about this is that this is basically expanding politicians' power over one of their main avenues of criticism.
Yes.
And my understanding of the role of politicians in today's politics is that they're sort of paid representatives for corporate interest. And it would be interesting to see the overlap between who's donating to which political parties and who's supporting this specific initiative.
Yes.
Because I imagine there will be overlap. And I imagine that the reason that they're doing this is because it can help push the sort of favorable treatment to certain companies, certain corporations within a nation by not only paying off the politicians effectively, which is what campaign donations are, and also helping neuter any criticism in the press about certain things.
Which is not a far-fetched, because if we look at, last week in my Common Sense Crusade, we covered the fact that if you Google assassination attempt, you won't find the photograph of Donald Trump's assassination attempt. If you Google Donald Trump, you'll get results for Kamala Harris. Like, there's an obvious, very clear bias that is being implemented by big tech and by mainstream media. And we talked just a moment ago about what Sky News were doing. The BBC were also doing the same and using these words as mostly peaceful, largely peaceful. There's a slant and a bias to all of this, but we'll get to today's most obvious example later on. But what I find also disturbing about this is the almost anti-competitive nature to it. There's a massive monopoly here. So if you're not part of this, you're going to be silenced, because Google, YouTube, they affect us, the Lotus eaters. Microsoft, Meta, they affect, again, likewise, independent journalists. If you have a smaller voice, you have to use the platforms that these guys are on.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no way around their censorship. It is collusion, and it's headed up by our state broadcaster, the BBC, which again is an arm's length away from our government. So one of the companies involved in this is the Associated Press. And I just found this fascinating because it's the first one listed, but as someone who's worked previously in the professional media, Associated Press are very, very influential. So GB News is a prime example. When people say, why are GB News going woke? They're suddenly talking about climate change. It's not necessarily that GB News are going woke. They don't write most of their headlines. They get sent these bulletins from the Associated Press. They take their bulletins, put them up online. Sometimes they may change a few words, but they just shovel out content that they're being sent.
Yeah, so I looked into this in great detail, actually, and lots of other... Reuters is another example of this.
Reuters and AP.
Yeah, both of those are sort of providers of resources for journalists in other institutions.
Yep.
And we actually, when Lotus Eaters first started, looked at getting photos from the Associated Press for some of our written articles. Just the photos. We didn't want the articles because obviously they'd be nonsense. But we wanted to use relevant photos because of all of the usage rights and the copyright law and stuff like that. We wanted to make them interesting and relevant and to compete with the mainstream media.
Yeah.
And I was the one actually leading the process in that. And I learned a lot about how they operate, how these sorts of things work. And in the end, we realized it was a massive rip-off and not worth it. So we didn't go through with it. But yes, it's very interesting. And this is part of the reason, I think, that a lot of media organizations have very similar headlines, is that it comes from the Associated Press and Reuters.
Yes.
And if you can control the narrative in both of those, well, you can control the press.
That's it, exactly. You don't need to control the entire press. You just need to control Associated Press and Reuters. And they send out the bulletins, the pictures, the headlines, and the content to all of these agencies. And some of them change them, some of them fiddle them around, but a lot of them just push it all straight online. And so that is a key part of the problem we're facing right now. Now, this Trusted News Initiative, which I mentioned was set up over COVID-19, specifically to combat disinformation, which essentially from a government's point of view means not talking about the things that they don't want us to talk about, has also it's moved on. So it started with COVID. They had their Trust in News conferences. They had the latest one was about these issues here. So Ukraine, what is disinformation about Ukraine? Well, since we are an ally of Ukraine and effectively at war, a proxy war with Russia, we can pretty much sum up that certain news is going to be classed as disinformation, whether it's true or not, because they'll mark it as propaganda. Nationalization of the internet. I genuinely don't.
That's horrifying. If the internet were nationalized, I would despair for the fate of humanity.
But in some places it is. China have their firewall, North Korea have their blackouts, India have had theirs during the elections. It's not too far-fetched. Imagine we could have the same very soon. Mainstream media have been talking about it a lot this week. Should we be able to ban social media during riots and unrest?
It's ridiculous because, people will always find ways to communicate with each other. Taking away the tools isn't going to get rid of the motivation. It's the same with social media. It's the same with mass shootings in the US. People blame the tools for what is fundamentally a question of human motivation.
Yes. And blocking one thing just means you use something else.
Exactly.
Over COVID, they prevented us from going to church and they closed the pubs. So that stopped our association, which is why we did everything online. But I mean, if they blocked online, we'd go the other direction. There's always a way around it. But of course, they're always going to try to just block what they call disinformation. Climate change, another very obvious example that there is an approved narrative there that they want to push. And so they will use the Trusted News Initiative to push that narrative. Artificial intelligence, again, another concerning one. I don't know what the approved narrative is for that, but I do know there are very many clear biases in artificial intelligence, or the most prominent AI engines that are in use at the moment. So whether you're writing reports or doing research, whatever you're doing, there is a skewed bias towards liberalism.
The funny thing is, there are ways of getting around this. Like ChatGPT has obviously had a woke lobotomy, but then I use it to tell me what ethnicity perpetrators of crimes are. I say, what's the statistical likelihood that this person came from whatever country? And it will say, it's most likely they're from Pakistan or Somalia or something like that. because that way it can trawl through all the list of names.
Right.
You just got to frame it correctly and know how to use it and get good results. But it's almost going to be impossible to make it bulletproof without making it almost useless.
Yeah. But at the same time, you can only work with what data set it has. Mm-hmm. So if it's the Liberals pushing the data set, even if you work around it, you've got certain limitations there. And another example was people searching about Donald Trump's assassination, and the AI would say, nothing, don't know what that is about. But then you say, what happened on this date? And it will say, oh, the assassination attempt of Donald J. Trump. Mm-hmm. And so it has the information, but again, it's hiding it for a political reason. And the role in big tech of tackling disinformation was another major topic at this conference. So again, they're very explicit in that they want the big tech companies, not just the media companies, to have an impact on what they see as disinformation. And we saw this with the Twitter files, when we learned that the FBI, for example, had a backdoor to Twitter to say, block that person, delete that thread.
And actually looked at some of the specific cases that were listed. And some of them were really small accounts tweeting into the void. And even then, they're just like, remove this information is dangerous. Even though it's just an anonymous account with like 5 likes on the tweet, some of them, which is absurd. That level is one thing to have censorship at all. And obviously I disapprove of all censorship.
Right.
However, when it's to that level of pettiness, it shows you the lengths that they're willing to go.
Yes, to cover it up at all costs. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the potential presidential candidate, has filed an antitrust lawsuit in Texas against the TNI, against the Trusted News Initiative, which of course is global. And he's saying that it is pretty much similar to what we've said on the show so far, that it's a monopoly of information. It is an antitrust situation, and he called them the disinformation dozen. And I think, I'm hoping that will go some direction to finding out what happened over COVID in terms of what news sources were blocked, who was prevented from speaking, particularly when it came to the vaccine or the jab information. Because what was classed as disinformation at the beginning is certainly truth or allowed at this point.
And this is a very important thing as well. It's good that he's doing it in Texas, but if they're allowed to continue operating, it's going to be the case that elites, perhaps many of them unelected as well, are going to determine what we can say in our own countries, despite the fact that it's meant to be us that appoint them power, not the other way around.
Yeah, it's becoming tyrannical. It's an obvious example, but at the start of COVID, we weren't allowed to ask about the Wuhan lab. That was taken off Facebook, taken off Twitter at the start. Now we know that that's the most probable outcome of where it came from, a Wuhan lab. And so it was disinformation or misinformation at the beginning, and now it's commonly known as the truth. And so for these people to be the arbiters of truth is a scary prospect. And why is it relevant? Well, when Boris Johnson was our prime minister, he gave a bung, as he refers it, to the media. And Dominic Cummings confirmed this, that he heard Boris Johnson speaking directly about this, about giving the media a wad of cash in order to put forward a certain approved narrative. And there are investigations into what this meant, what this bung of cash meant. But the fact that the Prime Minister can have a direct conversation with Lord Egnevi, Lord Lebedev, the only Evening Standard guy anyway, and say, look, this is what we need. And then, of course, we saw across all the papers, the COVID, same headlines, same image, the same message, whether it's right-wing paper, left-wing paper. And this is exactly why, because of the government's working through the Trusted News Initiative. Which brings me back to your last topic of where we are today. All of the newspapers are running the same headlines, whether they're right or left. So we had the Times, thousands take to the streets to confront the far right. So a centre-right paper, versus The Guardian, a far-left paper, thousands take to the streets to counter threat from far right. I mean, it's one word difference, for goodness sake. Same layout, same image, same headline. This is being fed to them.
They're copying each other's homework, aren't they?
We've got the Mirror, again, their Unity, and then that picture, and the Daily Express, Unity, and then that picture. This is clearly being pushed through the Trusted News Initiative, through the behavioral insights, or the nudge unit. One or both of these government arm's length bodies are having an impact on what we're seeing in our mainstream media. They're trying to manipulate us. Here was the other one. I think this was the one you were looking for. So we've got the Independent. So all the newspaper agents agencies were talking about this so-called 100 far-right demos that were going to happen last night. Though, of course, none of them happened. Independent, far left. Al Jazeera, far Islamist. The Standard, center left. The Guardian, again, far left. All these papers talking, same headlines, same content, all talking about 100 far-right protests. Who told them? Where did they get that information from? If I was saying it and nothing happened, I'd be accused of misinformation, potentially arrested at this point, the way the government's going. Why is there no consequences for these mainstream media outlets?
Well, if hope not hate are to be believed, it all comes from one man in a Telegram chat.
One man potentially named Nick Lowles. Sky News as well. And of course, so that's just stuff in the print, but it's not just print where this is happening. Oh, here's the one, Daily Mail.
Yeah, night anti-hate marchers face down the thugs.
Did they? Who did they face down?
Yeah, no one. No one turned up.
They faced
What
down
are they
themselves.
looking in the mirror?
I love Steve Edgington. The Daily Mail backs the refugees welcome pro-Palestine and far-left Islamist protesters coalition. Yeah, indeed. The so-called right-wing paper is backing the hard left. Why would that be unless there was some kind of incentive for them to do so? Someone's leaning on them in some way. But it's not just print, it is also in television. There's a pattern developing. This was GMB earlier this week. I'm sure it's probably been covered.
Because we've talked about this a few times in the last few days, like many of our viewers will.
So here we have Ed Balls interviewing his wife, Yvette Cooper, a government minister. The topic of conversation.
Have done at home since those terrible killings in Southport. There have been identifiable individuals on social media who have been inciting not just riot, but violence. They've been using racist language. They've been using falsehoods about what happened in Southport. This is happening on the social media platforms. What can be done? What should be done now by the social media companies and the police and the government to stop this happening? Because it's been happening for a week.
Well,
doesn't matter what she waffles on. The point is, the question from the mainstream media is, what are you going to do about social media? Zip forward a few days later, same channel, mainstream media, Good Morning Britain, one of the most watched morning breakfast programs in the country.
I think we should stop it. It's only a temporary measure in order to limit the spread of inflammatory information, misinformation as well, across the United Kingdom at this point. And
so they found a useful idiot to say, yes, we should. But the question they're asking, ban social media during unrest?
Also, temporary measure, just like the lockdowns. Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
it's only 2 weeks. Oh, don't worry.
Flatten the curve. Also, to keep people safe.
Yeah.
To keep who safe?
Yeah.
Not us.
You just need to go in the prison cell to keep people safe.
But the media is pushing this question now, should we ban social media? And of course, it's not about social media. It's about Twitter, otherwise known as X. It's about Elon Musk, who has been mentioned to the police chief of the Met. And I think the DDP, the Director of Public Prosecutions, mentioned him. Anyway, the point is that they are clamping down because it's the one platform they cannot yet control the narrative on. It's not part of the Trusted News Initiative. It's not part of that big tech, Google, Meta, and all those things that they see it as a threat.
Well, it certainly is.
And so to wrap up, I'll leave you with the question of, is the far right really the problem, or is it the people manipulating us into believing that the far right is the problem? Something's clearly afoot here, because there were very little far right in Josh's segment. There was very little far right in what I've seen so far, but there's lots of evidence of the hard left. From people saying from the river to the sea, people promoting genocide of Jews. And so there are real threats to people. There are real incitement of violence and very few consequences for them. Yet there's an imaginary threat of violence from an imaginary far right, and they want to do everything to take our freedoms away to protect us from that imaginary threat. Something's not right.
Hear, hear. We do have some more Rumble chats. The Shadow Band for $50. That's very nice of you. Thank you. This stuff terrifies me. I want my thoughts and opinions to be my own, but to know how malleable human opinion is.
The sharing of...
Sorry, that was me.
Got jump scared by an American there. Windpill Seeker says, sounds like nudge, get government grants, but no government oversight to ensure plausible deniability, like an activist lobby group with a consulting division. Yeah, well, it's actually better. This is a theme I've heard throughout a lot of modern politics, is that you can do more outside of politics than you can do within it.
Oh, yeah.
Lots of senior government ministers have said this.
Yeah. This is why Michael Gove chose not to stand in the last election.
Exactly. It's that the new power is being an unelected corporatist, or because you also make a lot more money.
And you're unaccountable.
So why would people go through politics? Why would people use those means?
Why be the puppets when you could be the puppet masters?
Exactly. All right.
Well, there's another example. This is an old one, but it's just highlighting this media trusted news initiative, the idea that we could get every outlet singing from the same hymn sheet.
False news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these things.
I've seen this video before, it's very good.
We are fighting the fake news. It's fake, phony, fake.
Anyway, I'm not interested in the asset building, but I thought this was the long clip. I've got the wrong clip. But anyway, it essentially shows that they can get them all reading from the same script, all saying the same thing and manipulating us constantly. They're saying that they are fighting against fake news on social media, but actually the fake news is the mainstream media, and they are the threat.
I hope you appreciated that segment from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters. And if you want to see what else we're up to, we recently put out a video, the England riots, where we talked about the situation, believe it or not, in England. And if you want to see what else we're doing, all the other work, you don't want to miss anything, you can follow us on Twitter. We post links to everything we're putting out. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.